The Habsburgs, their name echoed through the grand halls of Europe, whispered in fear and reverence alike. For centuries, this family spun a web of power, marrying their way to thrones, conquering their way to empires. They ruled lands stretching from the sun-drenched beaches of Spain to the snow-capped peaks of Austria, their influence touching every corner of the known world. But even for a dynasty so powerful, so seemingly invincible, there were those who dared to challenge them, foes so formidable. They threatened to tear the entire Habsburg world apart. These were not mere skirmishes. These were personal vendettas, epic clashes of will, struggles for survival that reshaped history itself. Prepare to step back in time and witness the incredible stories of the 9 most powerful enemies who stood against the mighty Habsburgs, forever changing the course of kingdoms and the lives of millions. Number 1. Napoleon Bonaparte. The calendar turned to 1805, but for the Habsburgs, it felt like the world was spinning out of control. Emperor Francis I of Austria watched as a storm gathered on the horizon, a storm named Napoleon Bonaparte. This man, a whirlwind of ambition from Corsica, had already crowned himself Emperor of the French. He had torn through Europe, rewriting maps and shattering ancient rules. The old order, the one where Habsburgs felt so secure, was crumbling under his iron will. Francis, a man of quiet determination, knew he faced a different kind of war. This was not about ancient feuds or dynastic quarrels. This was about survival. Napoleon had already humiliated Austria in the past, forcing them to cede territory to watch their influence shrink. But now the stakes were higher than ever. Napoleon's Grande Armée was a machine fueled by revolutionary zeal and led by a military genius who seemed to defy all logic. The war began with Austria and Russia forming the Third Coalition, hoping to finally put an end to Napoleon's rampage. British money poured in, hoping to fund the armies that would crush the French. But Napoleon moved with lightning speed, striking before his enemies could fully gather their strength. His campaign in 1805 was a masterpiece of maneuver, a swift, brutal hammer blow. The Austrian army, led by generals who clung to outdated tactics, found themselves outflanked and outmaneuvered at every turn. The Ulm campaign was a disaster for the Habsburgs. General Karl Mack von Liebig, surrounded and outwitted, surrendered his entire army of nearly 30,000 men without a major battle. It was a humiliation of epic proportions, a stark reminder of the new brutal efficiency of French warfare. Vienna, the ancient heart of the Habsburg monarchy, lay exposed. Napoleon marched into the city, making the Schönbrunn Palace the very symbol of Habsburg power. His temporary headquarters. The Emperor Francis I had already fled, a king without a capital, a bitter taste in his mouth. But the ultimate showdown was yet to come. On December 2, 1805, near the small town of Austerlitz, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia. Emperor Francis I and Tsar Alexander I were both present, watching from a distance, their hopes pinned on their vast forces. The battle began in a fog, a cloak for Napoleon's cunning plan. He had deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the Allied forces into a trap. As they advanced, believing they were gaining the upper hand, Napoleon launched his main assault through the Pratzen Heights, the very center of the Allied line. The sun, famously dubbed the Sun of Austerlitz, broke through the mist, illuminating the chaos. The French elite, Imperial Guard, the heavy cavalry, hammered into the Allied lines. Panic spread through the Habsburg and Russian ranks. The fight was brutal, a swirling melee of bayonets and sabers. Thousands died in the frozen ponds as French artillery shattered the ice beneath their feet. By the end of the day, Austerlitz was a crushing victory for Napoleon, a strategic masterpiece that left the Habsburg and Russian armies shattered, their morale broken. The consequences for the Habsburgs were immediate and devastating. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed later that month, stripped Austria of vast territories. They lost Tyrol and Vorarlberg to Bavaria, Venice and Dalmatia to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy, and their remaining Swabian lands to Württemberg and Baden. These lands, once part of the ancient Holy Roman Empire, were now parceled out to Napoleon's German allies. It was a dismemberment of their ancestral domains, a wound that cut deep. The Holy Roman Empire itself, that venerable institution the Habsburgs had led for centuries, was dead. Napoleon, seeing it as an obstacle to his control of Germany, simply abolished it. In 1806, Emperor Francis I, who had once been Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor, was now just Francis I, Emperor of Austria. It was a title he had created for himself in 1804, a desperate attempt to salvage some prestige as Napoleon's power grew, but it was a hollow victory. 1,000 years of history gone in a stroke of Napoleon's pen. The Habsburgs were not finished, however. They nursed their wounds, rebuilt their armies, and waited for their chance. In 1809, driven by national fervor and a desire for revenge, Austria declared war on Napoleon again, despite being largely alone. This war of the Fifth Coalition saw Archduke Charles, Francis's brother and a skilled commander, achieve the first significant defeat of Napoleon's army at the Battle of Aspern-Essling. It was a glimmer of hope, a moment of triumph against the seemingly invincible French. But Napoleon was not one to be easily beaten. He reinforced his army and just weeks later crushed the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram. It was another immense battle, one of the largest in European history up to that point. The sheer scale of the fighting, the artillery barrages, the desperate charges, left tens of thousands dead or wounded. The defeat at Wagram was another heavy blow, forcing Austria to sign the Treaty of Schönbrunn. More territory was lost, including Trieste, and parts of Galicia and Austria was forced to pay a massive war indemnity. Perhaps the greatest humiliation came in 1810, when Napoleon, seeking to solidify his dynasty, divorced Empress Josephine and married Marie-Louise, the daughter of Emperor Francis I. The Habsburg princess, a descendant of emperors, was given to the man who had repeatedly crushed her family and dismembered their empire. It was a marriage of convenience for Napoleon, a symbol of his domination over the oldest royal house in Europe. For Francis I, it was a bitter pill to swallow a final act of submission to the Corsican upstart. Marie-Louise would bear Napoleon a son, the King of Rome, a child who represented the merger of two dynasties, but one born from conquest and coercion. Even as Napoleon's star began to fade after the disastrous Russian campaign in 1812, the Habsburgs played a careful game. Clemens von Metternich, Austria's shrewd foreign minister, navigated the complex alliances, biding his time, positioning Austria to be a key player in the final push against Napoleon. When Austria finally joined the Sixth Coalition, it was with a massive rebuilt army. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of the Nations, saw armies from across Europe clash with Napoleon's forces. Austrian troops fought alongside Prussians, Russians, and Swedes, finally overwhelming the French emperor. Napoleon was defeated, exiled, and then returned only to face his final defeat at Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna, held in the very city Napoleon had twice occupied, marked the ultimate Habsburg triumph. Emperor Francis I and Metternich played pivotal roles in shaping the new European order. While Austria did not regain all its lost territories, it emerged as a dominant force in the new concert of Europe, a system designed to prevent another Napoleon from rising. Yet the scars of those years, the humiliation of defeat, the loss of their imperial title, the forced marriage, lingered in the memory of the Habsburgs for decades. Napoleon Bonaparte had not just fought them. He had redefined what it meant to be an emperor, and had forced the proud Habsburg dynasty to bend, if only for a time, to his will. Number 2. Frederick the Great of Prussia. The year was 1740, and the Habsburg world was about to be rocked to its core. Emperor Charles VI had died, leaving behind no male heir, only his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa. For years, Charles had labored to secure the Pragmatic Sanction, an agreement among European powers, recognizing his daughter's right to inherit all Habsburg lands. He believed he had guaranteed her succession, ensuring the continuity of his ancient house. He was wrong. Almost immediately upon Charles's death, a young ambitious king seized his chance. Frederick II, the newly crowned king of Prussia, saw an opportunity too good to miss. Prussia, a growing power in northern Germany, had long eyed the rich industrial province of Silesia. A Habsburg jewel, Frederick, known as Frederick the Great, did not hesitate. Within weeks of Charles VI's death, his armies marched into Silesia, igniting a conflict that would define the next 2 decades for the Habsburgs. The War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa, a woman of formidable will and sharp intellect, found herself thrust onto the global stage, barely out of her teens. She was pregnant at the time, facing a coalition of enemies eager to carve up her inheritance. Bavaria, Saxony, France, and Spain all joined Prussia in challenging her right to rule. It was a baptism of fire for the young Archduchess, a desperate fight for survival. Frederick, a brilliant military strategist and an equally cunning diplomat, proved to be Maria Theresa's most relentless and dangerous adversary. He was a master of surprise, a king who personally led his troops into battle unafraid of danger. His Prussian army, meticulously trained and disciplined by his father, King Frederick, William I, was a lean, efficient fighting machine superior to the larger, more traditional Habsburg forces. In many ways, the first major clash came at Malwitz in 1741. It was a close-run battle, but the Prussian infantry, famed for their firing discipline, eventually pushed back the Austrians. Frederick, who had initially fled the field, believing the battle lost, returned to find his generals had secured victory. Silesia, for now, was lost to the Habsburgs. The war dragged on for years, with battles raging across Europe. Maria Theresa, despite her initial vulnerability, proved to be an inspiring leader. She rallied her Hungarian nobles, famously appearing before them with her infant son Joseph in her arms, appealing to their loyalty. Her impassioned plea, delivered in Latin, secured their crucial support. Moriamur pro rege nostro Maria Theresia, they declared. Let us die for our king, Maria Theresa. It was a moment of powerful defiance, a testament to her emerging strength. Even though Maria Theresa managed to secure her throne, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 confirmed Prussia's possession of Silesia. It was a bitter pill for the Empress. Losing such a valuable province to a rising rival was a blow to Habsburg prestige and economic power. But Maria Theresa was not one to forget or forgive easily. She vowed to regain Silesia, and this burning desire for revenge would set the stage for the next great conflict. This desire for revenge led to what is perhaps the most famous diplomatic revolution in European history. For centuries, France and the Habsburgs had been sworn enemies, but Maria Theresa, guided by her astute foreign minister, Count Wenzel Anton Kaunitz, forged an unthinkable alliance with France, abandoning their traditional ally Great Britain. This new alignment of powers, aimed squarely at Prussia, set the stage for the 7 Years' War, a truly global conflict that erupted in 1756. Frederick, feeling surrounded and threatened by this new grand alliance of Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden, struck first, invading Saxony. He aimed to knock out one of his enemies before they could fully mobilize. The war was brutal and relentless. Frederick, despite facing overwhelming odds, repeatedly demonstrated his military genius. He scored stunning victories at Rossbach against the French and at Leuthen against the Austrians, cementing his reputation as one of the greatest commanders in history. Maria Theresa, however, refused to give up. Her generals like Leopold Joseph von Daun and Ernst Gideon von Laden fought bravely and inflicted defeats on Frederick too, notably at Kolin in 1757, where Frederick himself was nearly captured. The war was a grueling test of endurance for both sides. Prussia, a small kingdom, was constantly on the brink of collapse, drained of men and resources. The The Habsburgs, with their larger empire, also suffered immense losses, their treasury strained. The war reached a climax in 1762. Russia, a key member of the anti-Prussian coalition, suddenly withdrew from the war after the death of Empress Elizabeth and the ascension of the Prussophile Tsar, Peter III. This unexpected turn of events saved Frederick from certain defeat. With Russia out, the alliance against him weakened, exhausted. All sides eventually agreed to peace. The Treaty of Hubertusburg in 1763 brought the 7 Years' War to an end. For the Habsburgs, it was another painful acknowledgement. Silesia remained firmly in Prussian hands. Maria Theresa, despite her valiant efforts and the immense sacrifices of her people, never recovered her lost province. Frederick the Great, against all odds, had defied the combined might of Europe's major powers and cemented Prussia's status as a great power. He had done it largely at the expense of the Habsburgs, establishing Prussia as a powerful rival within the German lands and forever altering the balance of power in Central Europe. The rivalry between Habsburg, Austria, and Hohenzollern-Prussia would continue to shape German politics for another century, a direct legacy of Frederick the Great's audacious challenge. Number 3. Louis XIV of France. For over a century, the Habsburgs had been locked in a titanic struggle with the Bourbon kings of France. But as the 17th century drew to a close, this rivalry reached its most intense personal and costly phase under the reign of France's Sun King, Louis XIV. He was a monarch who believed in absolute power, a king who declared, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. And for Louis, the Habsburgs, the ancient rulers of Spain and Austria, represented the ultimate challenge to his vision of French dominance in Europe. The conflict with Louis XIV was not a single war, but a series of brutal, interconnected struggles that spanned decades, draining treasuries and costing millions of lives. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, a quiet and pious man, found himself locked in a relentless contest with his flamboyant and aggressive French cousin. One of the earliest clashes came in the War of Devolution, 1667 to 1668. Louis, using a flimsy legal pretext involving the inheritance rights of his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, who was also Leopold's half-sister, invaded the Spanish Netherlands, a key Habsburg possession. He quickly seized much of the territory, demonstrating the strength of his newly reformed French army. The Triple Alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, and Sweden eventually forced Louis to make peace, but he retained some key towns. A clear sign of his expansionist ambitions, the true storm broke with the Dutch War, 1672 to 1678. Louis XIV, furious at the Dutch for thwarting his earlier ambitions, launched a massive invasion of the Dutch Republic. The Habsburgs, realizing that French expansion threatened their own interests in Germany and the Spanish Netherlands, joined forces with the Dutch, Spain, and Brandenburg. Emperor Leopold I mobilized his armies, sending them to fight on multiple fronts. The war was long and costly. Louis's military genius, combined with the strategic brilliance of his general, Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Viscount of Turenne, and the engineering prowess of Vauban, saw France achieve significant victories. The Treaty of Nijmegen, though it did not grant France total victory, solidified Louis's gains in the Spanish Netherlands and Franche-Comté, further chipping away at Habsburg control. But the greatest and most devastating conflict was still to come. The question of the Spanish succession hung heavy over Europe. King Charles II of Spain, a sickly and childless Habsburg, was nearing his end. Both the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons had strong claims to the vast Spanish inheritance, which included not just Spain itself, but its rich colonies in the Americas, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, and Milan. Emperor Leopold I believed the Spanish throne rightfully belonged to his family, a continuation of the Habsburg line. Louis XIV, however, desperately wanted to place his grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, on the Spanish throne, creating a formidable Bourbon bloc that would dominate Europe. When Charles II died in 1700, his will surprisingly named Philip of Anjou as his sole heir. Louis XIV accepted the will famously, declaring, "There are no longer any Pyrenees." This statement sent shivers down the spines of the Habsburgs and other European powers. The idea of a combined Franco-Spanish Bourbon Empire controlling vast resources and territories was an existential threat to the balance of power. Emperor Leopold I, now an old man, refused to accept. He immediately launched the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest and most widespread conflicts in European history. He formed the Grand Alliance with England, soon Great Britain, after 1707, the Dutch Republic, and later Portugal and Prussia. The stage was set for a truly global war. The fighting raged for over a decade, from the fields of Bavaria to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the Low Countries to the Americas. The Habsburgs, led by their brilliant general Prince Eugene of Savoy, a man who had actually been denied a commission by Louis XIV in his youth, fought alongside the English general John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. These two commanders, working in close concert, inflicted crushing defeats on Louis's armies. At the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, Marlborough and Eugene annihilated a combined Franco-Bavarian army. A stunning victory that saved Vienna from French occupation and shattered the myth of French invincibility. It was a moment of immense relief and celebration for the Habsburgs, who had been on the defensive for so long. Other major victories followed, like Ramillies, 1706, and Oudenarde, 1708, further pushing back French power in the Low Countries. Yet, Louis XIV, despite suffering devastating losses, refused to yield. France, though exhausted, fought on, defending its borders with ferocity. The war dragged on, becoming a costly stalemate. Finally, after years of attrition with both sides utterly exhausted and facing domestic pressures, peace negotiations began. The treaties of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, brought an end to the War of the Spanish Succession. The Habsburgs, now led by Emperor Charles VI, Leopold's son, did not get the Spanish throne. Philip V, Louis XIV's grandson, remained King of Spain, establishing the Bourbon dynasty there. However, the Habsburgs gained significant territories as compensation. They acquired the Spanish Netherlands, which became the Austrian Netherlands, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, and Sardinia, which they later exchanged for Sicily. These gains were substantial, consolidating Habsburg power in Italy and the Low Countries, even as they lost their ancestral connection to Spain. The wars with Louis XIV had been incredibly damaging for the Habsburgs, forcing them to fight for their very survival against a king who dreamed of universal monarchy. They lost their undisputed primacy in Europe and France, emerged as a dominant force, but they also survived. They demonstrated their resilience, their ability to form vast alliances, and their capacity to produce brilliant military leaders like Prince Eugene. Louis XIV, for all his ambition and military prowess, could not break the Habsburg spirit. His wars had left France economically drained, and the grand ambitions of the Sun King ultimately failed to achieve full European hegemony. The long, bitter struggle with Louis XIV had tempered the Habsburgs, preparing them for the challenges of the coming century. Number 4. The Hungarian rebels. Imre, Thokoli, and Ferenc Rákóczi II. The Habsburg Empire, for all its vastness and prestige, was never a perfectly unified realm. It was a patchwork of nations, languages and religions, held together by the loyalty or sometimes simply the pragmatic acceptance of its diverse populations. One of the most persistent and powerful challenges to Habsburg authority came from within their own borders. From the proud and often rebellious Kingdom of Hungary, for centuries the Magyars had fought for their unique identity and privileges, often clashing violently with their Habsburg overlords. Two figures in particular stand out as the fiercest Hungarian enemies the Habsburgs ever faced: Imre Thököly and Ferenc Rákóczi II. The stage for Thököly's rebellion was set by decades of Habsburg rule that often felt heavy-handed and dismissive of Hungarian rights. While the Habsburgs had helped drive back the Ottoman Turks from much of Hungary, their rule brought with it attempts to centralize administration, suppress Protestantism, and impose taxes without full consent. Hungarian nobles, fiercely independent, guarded their ancient constitutional liberties. Many were Calvinists or Lutherans, wary of the staunchly Catholic Habsburg efforts at counter-reformation. Imre Thököly emerged as a leading figure in the late 17th century. A monarch count from an old noble family, his personal story was one of tragedy and revenge. His father had been executed by Habsburg authorities, fueling Thököly's deep-seated resentment. In 1678, at the head of a band of disaffected Hungarian nobles and soldiers known as Kuruk, rebels Thököly launched a full-scale uprising. He was a skilled military leader, combining the tactical acumen of a seasoned commander with the fiery passion of a nationalist. Thököly's rebellion quickly gained momentum. His forces, often operating with great mobility and striking power, defeated Habsburg garrisons and captured key towns across northern and eastern Hungary. He became a folk hero to many, seen as a defender of Hungarian liberties and Protestant rights against Habsburg absolutism. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, preoccupied with conflicts against France, found himself with a serious and costly internal rebellion on his hands. To the dismay of the Habsburgs, Thököly even forged an alliance with their greatest external enemy, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed IV, seeing an opportunity to destabilize the Habsburgs, recognized Thököly as King of Upper Hungary. This alliance was a truly dangerous development. It meant the Habsburgs faced a two-front war with Hungarian rebels, supported by the vast resources of the Ottoman Empire. Striking from within, Thököly's power reached its peak during the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683. He led his Hungarian forces alongside the Ottoman army, adding another layer of complexity and danger to the desperate defense of the Habsburg capital. While Vienna ultimately held, and the Ottomans were decisively defeated by a relief army led by Polish King John III Sobieski and Duke Charles V of Lorraine, Thököly's involvement demonstrated the profound threat he posed. He was not just a regional rebel, he was a strategic partner of their most formidable foe. After the Ottoman defeat at Vienna, Thököly's fortunes began to wane. The Habsburgs, now fully committed to expelling the Ottomans from Hungary, launched a series of campaigns that steadily pushed back both the Turks and Thököly's forces. Thököly himself was eventually arrested by his Ottoman allies, who suspected him of treachery, though he was later released. He continued to fight a relentless thorn in the Habsburg side until he ultimately faded from the scene, spending his final years in Ottoman territory. He never saw a free Hungary, but his rebellion had shaken the Habsburg grip on the kingdom. Decades later, another great Hungarian rebel leader emerged following in Thököly's footsteps: Ferenc Rákóczi II. Rákóczi, like Thököly, came from a powerful noble family with a history of challenging Habsburg rule. He grew up witnessing the continued erosion of Hungarian rights and the imposition of a strong, centralized Habsburg administration. He was also a passionate advocate for Hungarian independence. Rákóczi's rebellion, known as Rákóczi's War of Independence, broke out in 1703, fueled by a mixture of resentment over new taxes, the presence of Habsburg garrisons, and lingering religious grievances. It came at a terrible time for the Habsburgs. They were deeply embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession against Louis XIV, committing vast resources and troops to the west. This left their eastern borders vulnerable, a strategic opening Rákóczi was quick to exploit. Rákóczi, a highly educated and Medoc leader, quickly rallied the Kuruk rebels, attracting widespread support among peasants, townsfolk, and a significant portion of the Hungarian nobility. His movement became a national cause, aiming not just for the restoration of traditional Hungarian liberties, but for outright independence from Habsburg rule. He was declared the ruling Prince of Hungary, establishing a parallel government, and issuing his own currency. Rákóczi's army, though often poorly equipped compared to the imperial forces, was fueled by fervent patriotism. They fought with incredible bravery and managed to control large parts of Hungary. The Habsburgs, already stretched thin by their wars in the west, found themselves fighting a desperate, bloody war on their home front. The conflict became a brutal war of attrition marked by sieges, guerrilla warfare, and pitched battles. Emperor Joseph I, Leopold's successor, struggled to contain the rebellion. He sent his best generals, like Guido Starhemberg, to Hungary, but Rákóczi's forces proved elusive and tenacious. The sheer scale of the rebellion was immense, forcing the Habsburgs to divert critical resources and troops that were desperately needed on the battlefields of Western Europe. This weakened their hand against Louis XIV and prolonged the War of the Spanish Succession. Rákóczi even sought alliances with foreign powers, notably with Louis XIV, the very king the Habsburgs were fighting in the West. This alliance, though it never fully materialized into a massive French invasion of Hungary, provided Rákóczi with crucial financial support and diplomatic recognition. It further highlighted the depth of the threat. He posed a Hungarian leader capable of drawing in the Habsburgs' greatest rivals. The tide slowly turned against Rákóczi. As the War of the Spanish Succession wound down, the Habsburgs were able to commit more troops to Hungary. Moreover, internal divisions within the Hungarian nobility, coupled with the sheer exhaustion of years of warfare, began to undermine Rákóczi's movement. Many longed for peace and feared the destruction of their lands. The final defeat came with the Peace of Szatmár in 1711. Rákóczi, refusing to accept the terms which would have meant swearing loyalty to the Habsburgs, chose exile. He spent the rest of his life abroad, never returning to his homeland, a symbol of unyielding resistance. Though his rebellion ultimately failed to achieve full independence, it forced the Habsburgs to make significant concessions to the Hungarian estates. They recognized Hungarian noble privileges, reaffirmed religious freedom for Protestants, and promised to respect the kingdom's distinct identity. The Hungarian rebellions of Thököly and Rákóczi were more than just local disturbances. They were profound challenges to the very concept of Habsburg rule, demonstrating that even a powerful dynasty could be brought to its knees by internal resistance, especially when combined with external pressures. These figures reminded the Habsburgs that their empire was a mosaic, not a monolith, and that the loyalty of its diverse peoples could never be taken for granted. The spirit of Hungarian independence, forged in these struggles, would continue to shape the relationship between Budapest and Vienna for centuries to come. Number 5. The Swedish Empire, Gustavus Adolphus. The Habsburg Empire, staunchly Catholic and ambitious, found itself entangled in a catastrophe that would rip Central Europe apart for 30 years. This was the 30 Years' War, a conflict fueled by religious fervor, dynastic ambition, and territorial greed for the Habsburgs, who saw themselves as the natural leaders of Catholic Europe and the Holy Roman Empire. The war was meant to consolidate their power. But then, a new and utterly unexpected enemy descended from the north. A king who would change the course of the war and send shivers down the spines of Habsburg generals. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, King of Sweden. When Gustavus Adolphus entered the fray in 1630, the war had largely been going in the Habsburgs' favor. Their armies, led by brilliant and ruthless commanders like Albrecht von Wallenstein and Count Tilly, had crushed the Bohemian Protestants, defeated Danish intervention, and seemed on the verge of imposing Catholic, Habsburg authority across the Holy Roman Empire, Protestantism in Germany. Many in the Protestant states looked north with desperation. Hoping for a savior, Gustavus Adolphus arrived like a hurricane. He was a deeply religious Lutheran, but also a pragmatic statesman and a military innovator of the highest caliber. He saw himself as a champion of Protestantism, but also recognized the opportunity to expand Swedish influence and secure control over the lucrative Baltic trade. His army, while not numerically overwhelming at first, was unlike any seen before. It was highly disciplined, motivated by religious conviction, and employed revolutionary tactics. He had developed combined arms warfare to an unprecedented degree. His infantry used lighter, more mobile muskets, and deployed in shallow linear formations that maximized firepower. His artillery was lighter, more easily maneuverable, and could fire faster. His cavalry, instead of relying on slow, pistol-based caracole tactics. He integrated these elements bracing, creating a flexible and devastating fighting force. The Habsburg generals, accustomed to their traditional ponderous methods, were caught off guard. The first major clash came at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631. Here, Gustavus Adolphus faced the Imperial and Catholic League army, led by the aging but still formidable Count Tilly. Tilly's veterans were renowned, having won battle after battle. But at Breitenfeld, the Swedish army, fighting alongside their Saxon allies, utterly crushed Tilly's forces. The Swedish artillery outfired the Imperial guns, and the highly trained Swedish infantry systematically broke the Catholic lines. Tilly himself was wounded and his army was shattered. Breitenfeld was a thunder. Commies were not invincible. It swung the momentum of the war dramatically, breathing new life into the Protestant cause. Gustavus Adolphus no longer just a distant northern king was now a major player, a military genius who could humble the mightiest armies. After Breitenfeld, Gustavus Adolphus embarked on a lightning campaign through Germany. He marched to Hesse across the main river and deep into southern Germany, capturing fortresses and cities, liberating Protestant territories, and forcing Catholic princes to negotiate. His army moved with incredible speed and efficiency, living off the land but maintaining strict discipline. The Habsburgs watched with growing alarm as their influence in Germany evaporated. Emperor Ferdinand II, desperate to stem the Swedish tide, was forced to recall Albrecht von Wallenstein, his most brilliant but unpredictable general whom he had previously dismissed, due to Wallenstein's immense power and ambition. Wallenstein, raising a new army, implemented a scorched earth policy. Hoping to starve the Swedish forces, he aimed to confront Gustavus Adolphus in a decisive battle. The two titans finally met at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. It was a fog-shrouded, chaotic, and incredibly bloody engagement. Gustavus Adolphus, leading his troops from the front, rode into the thick of the fighting, his presence inspiring his men. The battle raged for hours, a desperate struggle for control of the muddy fields. The imperial forces suffered heavy casualties, but so did the Swedes. In the midst of the swirling chaos, Gustavus Adolphus was killed. Shot multiple times, he fell from his horse, his body later stripped by souvenir-hunting soldiers. His death was a devastating blow for Sweden and the Protestant cause. It plunged his army into temporary disarray and removed the most dynamic figure of the war. For the Habsburgs, it was a moment of immense relief, a reprieve from the relentless pressure Gustavus Adolphus had exerted. The Snow King, as some called him, had melted away. However, even in death, Gustavus Adolphus had fundamentally reshaped the conflict. His interventions had saved German Protestantism from annihilation. He had forced the Habsburgs onto the defensive, shattering their dreams of a unified Catholic Holy Roman Empire under their absolute control. His military reforms and tactics profoundly influenced European warfare for generations, teaching others the importance of discipline, mobility, and combined arms. The war continued for another 16 years after his death, becoming even more brutal and destructive, with France eventually replacing Sweden as the primary anti-Habsburg power. But it was Gustavus Adolphus who had first cracked the Habsburg dominance, who had demonstrated that their formidable armies could be beaten, and who had ensured that the 30 Years' War would not end with a decisive Habsburg victory. His powerful entry into the war, his stunning victories, and his revolutionary military genius remain a testament to his impact as one of the most formidable enemies the Habsburgs ever faced. Number 6. The Bohemian Protestants. Early 30 Years' War. Before the Swedish king, before the great French armies, The very first spark that ignited the cataclysmic 30 Years' War came from within the Habsburg realm itself. It came from the Kingdom of Bohemia, a land long simmering with religious and nationalistic tensions. The Habsburgs, as Holy Roman Emperors and Kings of Bohemia, had a complicated relationship with their Bohemian subjects. Many Bohemians were not Catholic. They were Hussites, Lutherans, or Calvinists. Followers of John Hus, a religious reformer burned at the stake centuries earlier, they cherished their religious freedoms and their ancient constitutional rights, which the staunchly Catholic Habsburg monarchs often viewed with suspicion. The flashpoint arrived in 1618. Emperor Matthias A. Habsburg, but his chosen successor, Ferdinand of Styria, was anything but. Ferdinand was a fervent Catholic, educated by Jesuits and utterly committed to the Counter-Reformation. He believed it was his sacred duty to restore Catholicism throughout his lands, even if it meant revoking existing religious freedoms. He was not subtle about his intentions. The Bohemian nobility, many of them Protestant, felt their liberties were under direct assault. They saw Ferdinand's actions, particularly his attempts to limit Protestant church building and administration, as a betrayal of promises made by earlier Habsburg emperors. Tensions boiled over on May 23, 1618 in Prague at the Bohemian Chancellery. A group of Protestant nobles, inflamed by what they perceived as grave injustices, stormed the building. They confronted two imperial regents, Jaroslav Borzita of Martinice and Wilhelm Slavata of Chlum, and their secretary, Philip Fabricius. The confrontation quickly turned violent. After a heated argument, the Protestant nobles seized the three men and, in an act of profound defiance and insult to Habsburg authority, threw them out of a high window of Prague Castle. This event, known as the Second Defenestration of Prague, was not a random act of hooliganism. It was a deliberate, symbolic gesture of rebellion, a rejection of Habsburg rule. The three men miraculously survived, landing in a pile of refuse or mud. But the message was clear. Bohemia was in open revolt. The Habsburgs, represented by Ferdinand, saw this as an unforgivable act of treason, a direct challenge to his imperial authority. For the Bohemian Protestants, it was a desperate stand for their religious and political freedom. Both sides were convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The rebellion quickly escalated. The Bohemian estates deposed Ferdinand as King of Bohemia, and in a truly shocking move offered the crown to Frederick V, the Calvinist elector, Palatine of the Rhine, a prominent German Protestant prince. Frederick, despite warnings, accepted, becoming known as the Winter King due to his short, ill-fated reign. This act of defiance was a direct blow to the Habsburg imperial ambition. Losing Bohemia, a key part of their hereditary lands and a major electoral territory in the Holy Roman Empire, was unthinkable. Emperor Ferdinand II, as he became in 1619, was determined to crush the rebellion and restore Catholic and Habsburg dominance. He formed alliances with the Catholic League, led by Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria, and secured the support of his cousin Philip III of Spain. The decisive confrontation came relatively quickly. On November 8, 1620, the Imperial and Catholic League armies, led by the experienced General Tilly, met the Bohemian and Protestant Union forces at the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague. The Bohemian army, a collection of conscripts and mercenaries, lacked discipline and cohesion. Many soldiers were unpaid and poorly led. The imperial forces, well drilled and motivated by religious zeal, quickly overwhelmed them. The Bohemian lines broke, and a rout ensued. Thousands of Bohemian soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered. Frederick V, the Winter King, fled Prague with his family, abandoning his new kingdom after barely a year on the throne. The battle was a crushing, humiliating defeat for the Bohemian Protestants. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Ferdinand II exacted a terrible revenge. The leaders of the rebellion, 27 Bohemian nobles and citizens, were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square in June 1621. Protestantism was severely suppressed. Churches were closed, ministers exiled, and people forced to convert to Catholicism or leave the country. Vast swaths of Bohemian land were confiscated from the Protestant nobility and given to loyal Catholic aristocrats and Habsburg military commanders, many of whom were foreign. The Kingdom of Bohemia lost its autonomy and was integrated more tightly into the Habsburg monarchy. Its separate chancery was abolished, and the Bohemian crown became hereditary in the Habsburg line. Removing the right of election, German replaced Czech as the language of administration. The demographic and religious landscape of Bohemia was fundamentally altered, leading to centuries of Habsburg dominance, while the Bohemian Protestants were ultimately crushed. Their initial act of defiance at the defenestration of Prague had lit a fuse that detonated the 30 Years' War. Their rebellion pulled in other German Protestant princes, then Denmark, and eventually Sweden and France, escalating a local dispute into a continental catastrophe. The Habsburgs had won the Battle of White Mountain, but the struggle they had unleashed would bleed their empire dry for decades, fundamentally altering the course of European history and ensuring that their dream of absolute Catholic universal monarchy would never be fully realized. The powerful challenge posed by these courageous, if ultimately defeated, Bohemian Protestants sent ripples of conflict across the entire continent. Number 7. The Dutch Republic. William of Orange. The Habsburg Empire, sprawling and dominant in the 16th century, held one of its richest jewels in the Low Countries, a collection of 17 provinces that stretched from modern-day Belgium to the Netherlands. These lands, inherited from the Burgundian dukes, were prosperous, vibrant, and fiercely independent, but their relationship with their Habsburg overlords, particularly with the stern and devout Philip II of Spain, was a powder keg waiting to explode. The figure who would light the fuse and lead the Low Countries into a brutal decades-long war for independence was William of Orange, a nobleman who became the very embodiment of Dutch resistance. Philip II, who inherited the Low Countries from his father, Emperor Charles V, was a staunch Catholic and an absolute monarch. He saw it as his divine duty to suppress the rising tide of Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, which had taken strong root in the northern provinces. He also sought to centralize power, imposing Spanish administrative methods and taxes, and sending the Spanish Inquisition to root out heresy. These policies clashed head-on with the deeply ingrained traditions of local autonomy, religious tolerance, and mercantile freedom that defined the Low Countries. William, Prince of Orange, was initially a loyal servant of the Habsburgs, a high-ranking nobleman who served in Charles V's court. He was medically intelligent and held vast lands and influence. However, as Philip II's policies grew harsher, William became increasingly disillusioned. He was horrified by the persecution of Protestants and the erosion of traditional liberties. He began to advocate for religious tolerance and greater autonomy for the provinces. The turning point came in the 1560s. Philip II sent the Duke of Alba, a ruthless Spanish general, with a large army to crush dissent and establish absolute control. Alba set up the Council of Troubles, soon nicknamed the Council of Blood, which condemned thousands of suspected heretics and rebels to death. This reign of terror, combined with new taxes, pushed the Low Countries to the brink of open revolt. William of Orange, sensing the futility of peaceful resistance, fled into exile. From Germany, he began to organize armed resistance. Though his initial efforts were unsuccessful, his early invasions failed, and his resources were meager. But the atrocities committed by Alba and the Spanish soldiers, coupled with the growing religious persecution, fueled a deep hatred for Spanish rule among the population. The Beggars, as the rebels became known, launched a guerrilla war on land and sea. The Sea Beggars, Dutch privateers, harassed Spanish shipping and captured key coastal towns like Brill. In 1572, this marked a significant turning point, providing a foothold for the rebellion. William, now known as William the Silent, not because he was quiet, but because he was discreet and shrewd, returned to lead the armed struggle. He was a master strategist, understanding that patience, diplomacy, and the exploitation of internal Spanish weaknesses would be key to victory. The war, which would eventually become known as the 80 Years' War, was incredibly brutal. It involved sieges, massacres, and scorched earth tactics. The Spanish army, though formidable, faced an elusive and determined enemy, fighting on their home turf. Cities like Haarlem and Leiden endured terrible sieges, with their inhabitants suffering starvation and disease, but often resisting with incredible tenacity. William of Orange proved to be an inspiring leader, rallying disparate factions and enduring immense personal hardship. He was repeatedly declared an outlaw by Philip II, a massive bounty placed on his head. He survived several assassination attempts. His resilience and unwavering commitment to the cause of Dutch freedom made him a symbol of resistance. His famous motto, "Je maintiendrai," I will maintain, reflected his commitment to upholding the rights and liberties of the Low Countries. The rebellion eventually split the Low Countries. The southern provinces, largely Catholic and more easily subdued by Spanish forces, eventually formed the Union of Arras and reconciled with Spain. But the northern provinces, primarily Protestant and fiercely independent, formed the Union of Utrecht in 1579, declaring their full independence from Spanish rule in 1581. The Act of Abjuration. They formally deposed Philip II as their sovereign. This was a revolutionary act, a group of subjects openly rejecting their king and forming a new republic. This defiance was a direct challenge to the very core of Habsburg power. Philip II, ruler of the vast Spanish Empire, could not tolerate such an affront. He poured immense resources, men and ships, into crushing the Dutch revolt. The conflict became a drain on the Spanish treasury, diverting resources that could have been used elsewhere in Europe or for colonial expansion. The Spanish Armada, launched in 1588, was partly intended to secure a base in the Netherlands and then invade England, which had been supporting the Dutch rebels. Its catastrophic defeat further weakened Spain's ability to subdue the Low Countries. William of Orange, despite his leadership, did not live to see the full triumph of his cause. He was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic in 1584, shot at close range. His death was a devastating blow to the Dutch. But the spirit of resistance he had ignited proved impossible to extinguish. His son Maurice of Nassau, and later his grandson Frederick Henry, took over militia strategists and engineers, mastering siege, warfare, and military organization. The war dragged on for decades, a testament to the stubbornness of both sides. Spain, proud and powerful, refused to acknowledge the independence of a rebellious province. The Dutch, resilient and resourceful, fought for their very existence. The conflict eventually became intertwined with the larger 30 Years' War, with the Dutch formally allying with the anti-Habsburg forces of France and Sweden. Finally, in 1648, after 80 years of continuous warfare, the Treaty of Munster, part of the wider Peace of Westphalia, formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. It was a momentous achievement, a small group of provinces achieving freedom from the most powerful empire in Europe. For the Habsburgs, particularly the Spanish branch, it was a colossal defeat, a loss of immense wealth, prestige, and territory. The war had bled Spain dry, contributed to its decline, and ushered in the golden age of the Dutch Republic, a testament to the indomitable will of the people. Led by William of Orange, his legacy as a powerful enemy to the Habsburgs was not just in his military leadership, but in his ability to inspire a people to fight for their liberty against overwhelming odds. Number 8. The Ottoman Empire, Suleiman the Magnificent. The Habsburgs had faced many enemies within Europe, but none loomed larger or represented a more existential threat than the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, this vast Islamic power, stretching from the Balkans to North Africa, represented a constant terrifying pressure on the Habsburg heartlands. And at the peak of its power, the Ottoman Empire was led by a sultan whose name struck fear into the hearts of Christians across Europe. Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1520, just as the young Charles V, head of the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs, was solidifying his vast but disparate empire. The two men, each ruling immense and powerful realms, were destined to clash. Suleiman was not just a conqueror. He was a brilliant administrator, a patron of arts and sciences, and a lawgiver. But to the Habsburgs, he was the embodiment of a relentless enemy, the leader of a force that threatened to engulf Christian Europe. The first major confrontation came swiftly. In 1521, Suleiman captured Belgrade, the strategic key to Hungary, a city that had long resisted Ottoman expansion. This was a clear signal of his intentions. The Ottoman war machine was efficient, disciplined, and seemingly unstoppable. The Habsburg-controlled Kingdom of Hungary, a crucial buffer state, was next in his sights. The true disaster for the Habsburgs came at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, a Habsburg relation, led a much smaller, ill-prepared army against the full might of Suleiman's forces. The battle was a catastrophe. Within hours, the Hungarian army was utterly annihilated. Tens of thousands of Hungarian nobles and soldiers perished. The defeat was so profound that it left Hungary in chaos, a gaping wound in the Habsburg defenses. The death of Louis II meant that his kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia, by previous dynastic agreements, passed to his brother-in-law, Ferdinand I of Austria, Charles V's younger brother. This acquisition vastly expanded Habsburg territory and brought them into direct, permanent conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Ferdinand, however, inherited a shattered Hungary, with much of it soon falling under direct Ottoman control or becoming a vassal state. Suleiman did not rest. He saw the opportunity to expand his empire deep into Central Europe. In 1529, he launched his most audacious campaign, the Siege of Vienna. The very capital of the Habsburg monarchy, the heart of their Austrian lands, lay under threat. A vast Ottoman army, estimated at over 100,000 men, marched across the plains, bringing with them a massive siege train. The city of Vienna, though small in population at the time, prepared for a desperate defense. Emperor Charles V was preoccupied with conflicts in Italy and Germany, leaving Ferdinand to organize the defense. The city's small garrison, reinforced by German and Spanish mercenaries, knew they faced an enemy of overwhelming numbers. The siege was brutal. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels under the walls, attempting to detonate mines. Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, launched repeated ferocious assaults. The fate of Christian Europe seemed to hang in the balance. If Vienna fell, the road to the Holy Roman Empire lay open. But the defenders, led by commanders like Nicholas Graf Somme, fought with incredible bravery and ingenuity. They countermined, they repelled assaults, and they endured terrible conditions. Heavy rains and disease also plagued the Ottoman army, making their task harder. After weeks of relentless fighting, and with winter approaching, Suleiman made the unprecedented decision to lift the siege Vienna had held. It was a moment of immense relief for the Habsburgs, but the threat remained. The struggle for Hungary continued for decades. Suleiman launched further campaigns into Hungary in the 1530s and 1540s. He annexed central Hungary, establishing direct Ottoman rule over Buda, the former Hungarian capital, which became the seat of an Ottoman pasha. Hungary was divided into three parts: Ottoman Hungary, Habsburg Royal Hungary, a strip of land to the west and north, and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania, which often sided with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs. The conflicts were not just large-scale battles. They were a constant war of attrition along a long, porous frontier. Border fortresses were repeatedly attacked and besieged. Raiding parties from both sides devastated the countryside. The Habsburgs spent immense sums building and maintaining a chain of fortifications known as the military frontier, manned by Croatian and Serbian soldier settlers to protect their borders. Charles V and Ferdinand I, despite their vast resources, were often stretched thin. Charles was constantly fighting France for control of Italy, dealing with the Protestant Reformation in Germany and battling Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, who were often allies of the Ottomans, against Suleiman. The Ottoman threat thus severely constrained Habsburg foreign policy and forced them to divert enormous resources to their eastern frontier. Suleiman died in 1566, still campaigning in Hungary, his empire at its zenith. His reign had been a period of relentless pressure on the Habsburgs. While he never conquered Vienna, his wars reshaped the map of Central Europe, bringing a significant portion of Hungary under direct Ottoman control for over 150 years. He stripped the Habsburgs of one of their most important buffer states and forced them into a defensive posture for generations. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman was not just a military foe. It was a competing civilization, a different world power with its own distinct culture, law, and religious beliefs, which viewed the Habsburgs as rivals for universal dominion. The constant Ottoman threat shaped Habsburg identity, reinforcing their role as defenders of Christendom. It drained their finances, forced them to seek alliances with other European powers, and became a defining feature of their strategic landscape for centuries. Suleiman the Magnificent truly earned his title as one of the most powerful and enduring enemies the Habsburgs ever faced. Number 9. Francis I of France. For the Habsburgs, being a sprawling dynastic power came with immense advantages, but also with one colossal headache. France. For centuries, the two great European families, the Habsburgs and the Valois, later Bourbons, of France, were locked in a bitter, almost ceaseless rivalry. And no early conflict defined this intense personal struggle more vividly than the series of wars waged against Francis I. The dashing, ambitious King of France, who was both a contemporary and a fierce adversary of the mighty Habsburg Emperor Charles V. Charles V, a man whose empire the sun literally never set on, inherited a truly immense domain: Spain and its vast American colonies, the Low Countries, the Habsburg lands, in Austria. But this vast power was perceived as a direct threat by Francis I, who believed that France, strategically located in the heart of Europe, deserved to be the dominant power. The stage was set for an epic clash of titans. The rivalry between Charles and Francis was deeply personal. Both men were young, ambitious, and hungry for glory. They even competed for the title of Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. A contest Charles won through a combination of political maneuvering and vast sums of borrowed money. This early defeat fueled Francis's resentment. Both rulers coveted the wealthy, strategically important states of northern Italy, particularly the Duchy of Milan, which served as a crucial bridge between Habsburg lands in Austria and Spain. Control of Milan meant control of vital trade routes and military access. The first of many wars between them, often called the Italian Wars, began almost immediately. In 1521, Francis launched an invasion of Milan. Charles, through his Spanish and imperial forces, countered swiftly. The fighting was fierce, involving complex maneuvers, sieges, and pitched battles. The armies were a mix of mercenaries from various nations, commanded by seasoned generals. The turning point came at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. Francis I, leading his army in person, found himself facing Charles V's imperial forces, which included the formidable Spanish infantry and German Landsknecht. Francis, ever impetuous, made a critical error, leading a cavalry charge that separated him from his supporting artillery. The imperial forces, especially their arquebusiers, decimated the French ranks. It was a catastrophic defeat for France. But the most shocking moment of Pavia was the capture of Francis I himself. He fought bravely, but his horse was killed beneath him, and he was surrounded. He was taken prisoner, a reigning monarch, King of France, captured by his greatest rival. It was an unprecedented Madrid. Francis was taken to Madrid and held captive. The Treaty of Madrid, signed under duress in 1526, forced him to make immense concessions, giving up all claims to Milan, Naples, Genoa, and Burgundy, and ceding territories in Flanders and Artois. However, once released, Francis immediately repudiated the treaty, claiming it was signed under duress. This act of defiance showed his stubbornness and determination. He promptly formed new alliances, including the League of Cognac with the papacy, Venice, Florence, and even the Ottoman Empire, the ultimate enemy of Christendom. This alliance with Suleiman the Magnificent, a pragmatic but shocking move, deeply infuriated Charles V and highlighted Francis's ruthless pursuit of his goals against the Habsburgs. The wars continued. In 1527, Charles V's largely unpaid imperial troops sacked Rome, a brutal event that further complicated the political landscape. Francis continued to challenge Charles, forming alliances with Protestant princes within the Holy Roman Empire, further destabilizing Charles's rule in Germany. He also supported Ottoman advances in the Mediterranean, turning a blind eye or even actively aiding their raids against Habsburg, Spain, and Italy. The wars between Charles and Francis lasted for decades, off and on, marked by periods of uneasy truce. They fought over Italy, over the Low Countries, and over the very prestige of being the foremost ruler. Each war bled both empires dry, consuming vast amounts of money and men. Francis, despite repeated defeats, including further invasions and the loss of more territory, never truly gave up. He was a master of diplomacy, always finding new allies and new ways to challenge Habsburg. His final war with Charles V, the Italian War of 1542 to 1546, once again saw major clashes across Europe. While neither side achieved decisive victory, it solidified the idea that neither monarch could fully dominate the other. Francis I died in 1547, just a few years before Charles V abdicated his thrones, exhausted by the relentless struggles. While Charles V often claimed victory and certainly controlled more territory, Francis I had successfully prevented the Habsburgs from achieving complete hegemony. In Europe, he had forced Charles to fight on multiple fronts, draining his resources and distracting him from other crucial matters like the growing Protestant Reformation in Germany. Francis I, through his sheer ambition, his willingness to form unconventional alliances, and his tenacious fighting spirit, proved to be a formidable and enduring enemy. He embodied the guillotine struggle between France and the Habsburgs, a rivalry that would persist for centuries and fundamentally shape the political map of Europe. He showed that even the most powerful empire could be challenged relentlessly by a determined and daring opponent.